Okay, today's Q&A is about Hafrashas Challah, and the question is, if you have to be Hafrashas Challah when you make pizza, what about if you make gluten-free challah? Do you have to be Hafrashas Challah for these cases? So, a basic rule of Hafrashas Challah is you have to be Hafrashas Challah if you only have to be Hafrashas Challah if what you're eating, what you're making, is something that you'd have to recite the bracha of Hamoitzi on, or if you ate enough of it, you recite Hamoitzi on it. So, pizza, if you eat enough pizza, you're going to recite Hamoitzi on it, and therefore you need to be Hafrashas Challah if you make pizza. However, that's only true if you make pizza from scratch. I mean, you take flour and water, or you take a pizza mix, a powdered mix, and you make the flour and you make the dough out of it like that. But because then in that case, the person who is making the dough, that's you, who's making the dough is a Jewish person, and therefore it needs Hafrashas Challah. But if you bought an already made dough from the store, then the person at home should not be Hafrashas Challah. And the reason is like this: if the people who made the dough in the factory it was a Jewish-owned company, then the hashgacha who oversees that factory would make sure they were Hafrashas Challah, because that's when they were responsible to be Hafrashas Challah as soon as they made the dough. If the company was made was not had no Jewish ownership, then there was no chiv hafrasha, and then you using it at home do not have to be Hafrashas either. So you only have to be Hafrashas Challah if you're making it from flour and water or from a mix where you're creating the dough. If a Jewish person is creating his own when you make the dough, that's when you're chayav in Hafrashas Challah. Now, another rule about Hafrashas Challah is you only have to be Hafrashas Challah if there's a specific amount of flour in the mix. We call that the shir challah. So for regular white flour, the shir is as follows: if there's 2.5 pounds of flour, you do hafrasha without a bracha, and if there's 4.7 pounds, then you do hafrasha even, and you make a bracha as well. Now, all the rules that I just mentioned are true for gluten-free challah or pizza or anything else, but a little bit of a twist on that. That's because like this. One common way to make gluten-free challah is to make something that's like bread, but you do it without any of the 5 grains. The 5 grains are wheat, rice, spelt, oats, and barley, and making gluten-free with rice, tapioca, corn, or other things like that, but none of those 5 grains. Well, if you have none of those 5 grains, then you don't make hamoitzi. And since you would not recite hamoitzi, then as I mentioned, there's no chiv Hafrashas Challah. But there's 2 other ways to make gluten-free challah or other foods, and one is to use gluten-free oats. Oats is one of the 5 grains, and the other is to use gluten-free wheat flour, what people call merino flour. And in both of those cases, the bracha on if you make a challah or something else out of it, the bracha is hamoitzi, because both of those are from the 5 primary grains, and therefore, from that perspective, you would have to be Hafrashas Challah from what you made. Now, as I mentioned, part of deciding whether you have chiv or Hafrashas Challah, one question is it hamoitzi, but the other question is there shir challah? Now, the 2 things to think about when you're making a gluten-free recipe. The first is, in a lot of cases, people who use gluten-free oats or gluten-free wheat flour mix in other grains also to help with the consistency of the dough. And as a rule, those other grains do not count towards the shir challah. So when you count deciding whether there's enough of oats or gluten-free wheat flour in the recipe, you have to decide, is there enough of those in the recipe, not just how much flour is it altogether in the recipe. And the second is that the shir of challah is not really a weight share. It's not really 2.5 pounds. Really, the shir is something volumetric. There's a certain amount of size. How much flour fits in a certain size container? So for regular white flour, that's 2.5 pounds or 4.7 pounds. But other grains is not the same. So for example, if you use oats, then for oat flour, it's just 1.8 pounds to be mafresh without a bracha, and 3.5 pounds to be mafresh with a bracha. Because if you were to put those into a container, those take up the same amount of space as the white flour, and therefore the shir challah for them is a different amount in pounds, but it's really the same amount in volume. Now, one other thing is that back to general Hafrashas Challah is that whole wheat flour, there's a difference of opinion about what the shir challah is for whole wheat flour, and that's as follows. Whole wheat flour is the same as white flour, but it also has bran. Now, if you make whole wheat flour by just grinding up the wheat and leaving the bran in it, it for sure counts towards the shir challah. But if you make white flour and you add bran into it, then the Shulchan Aruch says it does not count towards the shir challah. Nowadays, that's how most whole wheat flour is made. They make first white flour, with the bran separated from it, and then when they're ready to prepare whole wheat flour, they add the bran back into it. So, according to the simple reading of Shulchan Aruch, that bran was added back in. The bran does not count towards the shir challah, in which case you would need to have about 14% more flour in the mix to be chayiv and challah, because the bran part of it doesn't count. So when you have 2.5 pounds, 2.5 pounds is not enough flour to be Hafrashas Challah on. You need to have more than that. You need about 14% more than that in order to be chayiv and challah. Other people disagree, and that since nowadays the standard way to make a whole wheat flour is the way I just described, to add the bran back in, therefore it should count, in which case it would count towards the shir.